Lawyers of Reddit, what was your oh sh moment in court? Story 1. Not oh bad. Oh, I can't believe she said that. First jury trial, pretty serious charges. I'm cross-examining the alleged victim, and in answering my question, she says, "Oh yeah, I lie all the time." Needless to say, I won that trial. Story 2. Reposting myself from years ago. Story from a friend of mine. He was defending a guy in court. Don't remember what he was charged with. The main witness for prosecution was on the stand and was asked if she could identify the defendant. She was scanning the courtroom and seemed confused. My friend was already silently celebrating because if she couldn't identify him, he could probably get all charges dropped. As he was mentally adding this case to the win file, he happened to glance over at his client, who had just helpfully raised his hand to make it easier for her to identify him. Even the judge facepalmed on that one. Story 3. Never ask a question to which you don't know the answer. Prosecutor suggested to me client that the canned goods he had burgled were to be used to trade for drugs. Me thinking the idea ludicrous, asked my client whether he has ever traded food for drugs, to which he replied that he once exchanged a frozen chicken for heroin. Needless to say, I didn't win that one. Story 4. Sat in the public gallery at a bail hearing for a man accused of heinous crimes against a very, very young female relative. The judge started laying out the conditions of bail, and one of them was to surrender his passport. Man turned to his attorney and said loudly, words to the effect of, "But you said I could fly back to my home country." The judge stopped himself and revoked the man's bail. Edit. This post brought to you by the words flight and risk. Also, his home country was out of reach of extradition. Edit again. This was not in the USA. Every country has foreigners. Story 5. A lawyer I used to know was in court on a work injury case. The judge asked his client, "Just what is the nature of your injury?" His client replied, "I can't raise my arm this high anymore," while she raised her arm up to show just how high she couldn't raise it. Story 6. I was prosecuting a contempt action in family court, something that basically never works, and everyone in the room could tell I was winning. The other side was unprepared, out of arrogance, and I was basically ripping this guy to shreds on cross-examination, which his lawyer didn't even think would happen because he expected the case to be dismissed. At the end of the trial, the judge ruled for me and stated that she found the defendant's testimony to be untrustworthy. I was shocked at winning a contempt trial to begin with, but then this exchange happened. Defendant's attorney: "Your Honor, now that you have found my client's testimony to be untrustworthy, I am requesting a continuance in order to prepare further witnesses." This concept is shocking in and of itself, because to even think you can bring more witnesses after you rest your case is laughable. Judge: "You had your shot and you missed, counsel." Defendant's attorney: "Your Honor, there was no way I could have anticipated that you'd find my client's testimony untrustworthy, and as such, I didn't have the opportunity to prepare other witnesses in support of his position." Judge: "That may be an argument for your carrier, counsel, but it holds no water with me. See you this afternoon for sentencing." For those who didn't pick up on it, the judge basically told the lawyer, on the record in front of his client, that she expects him to get sued for malpractice because he fucked up so royally. That was mind-blowing on multiple levels. Story 7. I was the defendant, representing a non-profit that I volunteered for. The plaintiff was a 60-something grandma who was looking for a retirement settlement after falling out of her jacked-up pickup truck in our parking lot. The premise of her case was that our parking lot was in bad shape. It was, and that she fell into a pothole and broke her leg, which resulted in her having to take Coumadin and diminished her enjoyment of salads at the Friday night fish fry. No, really. It was going along fine, until my lawyer put up a photo of the pothole, taken the day of the incident, filled to the brim with water after a recent rain. He asked the lady if she had gotten her foot wet, to which she replied that she couldn't recall. He talked a little more about how perhaps if her foot wasn't wet, it might have been because she fell out of the truck and didn't really fall into the pothole. He asked again if her foot was wet, and she affirmed that yes, her foot was wet. The oh moment came when he went back to his desk, flipped through her deposition, and read the part where she was extremely adamant that her foot wasn't wet. Then he did some fancy legal stuff. The case was thrown out and I went back to work. Story 8. I was that almost screwed myself. I had 2 charges in 2 different courts. I accepted the first plea, which almost always carries probation, but my plea didn't have that condition. When it came time to accept the second plea, the prosecutor didn't include probation because she assumed my first charge put me on probation. She said as much to the judge, and me being a big dummy almost corrected her. My lawyer grabbed my shoulder and, told me to shut the up, she doesn't know. Story 9. Opposing counsel was a nightmare. Everything late, his work was extremely subpar, and so forth. Accused me of lying multiple times when he had dropped the ball. During another hearing in which he did another dumb move, judge says, "I'm glad you are the last case on the call, and all of the other attorneys have left the room, so they aren't here to hear me say that you are a terrible attorney." Story 10. I was just interning in court during law school, but I'm a lawyer now. Fight in a club, someone had broken someone else's jaw, and had 6 friends with him that insisted he had been identified wrongly because he never have a beard, and the victim said he had a beard. They used a very specific phrasing to the tune of, "My friend doesn't have facial hair because he is a professional in the food industry, and it would go against the regulations." After 3 of the witnesses had repeated the same exact phrasing, the judge stopped one to ask if he knew what a couple of the terms in that line meant, and the witness couldn't explain it. Defense lawyer got busted for instructing the witnesses. She'd also gotten the defendant to reject a plea deal that exchanged prison time for a fine and community service. Story 11. I was at a hearing arguing that my client was wrongfully terminated because the employer failed to abide by the proper procedures. During the hearing, a witness for the employer tried to offer documents that were fraudulently altered in order to make it look like the proper procedure was followed. I noticed the alteration. Opposing counsel quickly got that witness out of the room, and after a quick adjournment, my client got a large settlement. Story 12. Not exactly in court, but I was defending a juvenile robbery case where there was very little evidence. There was supposed to be 2 guys, but they only picked up this one kid. He had no stolen property on him. He was picked up like outside his own house, wearing different clothes than the victim had initially said. This kid was on the honor roll at school. His family seemed kind and were involved. He wrote poetry and played instruments. I actually believed it was a legit mistaken identity case. I went to meet with one of the kid's mentors for a character reference, and he exactly matched the description of the other robber. Story 13. Sitting in court, doing some plea paperwork with a defense attorney for a go-home plea agreement, where a person is released from custody and doesn't have to do jail time, we hear this shoo to our left, and we look to see his guy sitting in the galley all by himself, sitting in the cloud of a biggest vape hit I have ever seen, then has the audacity to tell the judge it went off in his hand, "Do not pass go, do not go free that day." Story 14. Lawyer here. I had a pre-trial conference at 9 a.m. at a court about 2 hours away, so I wake my up super early to drive in shitty weather to the conference. I get there and we're waiting for the other, in-town, attorney. All the while I'm grumbling to myself about how I'm from out of town and I can still make it on time. Finally, the court calls the other attorney's office and gets a receptionist who tells us through tears that other attorney passed away the night before. Needless to say, I was just happy to still be alive and we rescheduled for a few months later. Story 15. I'm not an attorney, but a reporter whose beat is the county courthouse, so I've had plenty of these moments happen in front of me. A guy was convicted of attempting to murder several police officers. At his sentencing, the prosecutor revealed the defendant got a prison tattoo while he was awaiting sentencing of a tombstone with the names of all the cops he attempted to kill. But the defendant still had the audacity to beg for a lenient sentence. He got a few hundred years in jail. Edit. Clarification in the 3rd paragraph. Story 16. I was interning during law school prosecuting domestic violence cases. The deputy DA asked me to talk for the first time during a guy's arraignment for beating his wife. An arraignment is when the defendant hears the charges against them and pleads guilty or not guilty, basically. When the judge calls on me to speak, I got insanely nervous and told the defendant that his charge carried a maximum penalty of 30 years when it was actually 30 days. He freaks out. The crowd, some in the gallery were his family and friends, gasps. The judge basically stops me and says, "I think you mean 30 days, counselor." After which everyone, including the defendant, laughed at me. *edit, because a lot of you are worried about this. The evidence was pretty weak, and the facts did not bear charging anything other than the lowest level misdemeanor, which in conjunction with this being a first offense meant that we were seeking 2 things primarily: counseling/anger management classes and probation. The intent being that any future problems can hopefully be avoided, and if not, we could stick the defendant with a harsh punishment the next time when we'd hopefully have better facts/evidence. Story 17. Represented a pro bono client that had just turned 18 and was charged with serious property damage. I walk into his bail hearing and the judge looks at him and goes, "I knew you'd be back as an adult." The judge then turns to me and says, "Counselor, you may want to learn about your client's history." No bail. Edit. To answer some of the questions below, 1. I considered it to be extremely inappropriate and objected to it. Juvenile records are sealed for a reason. The judge overruled the objection but made sure to articulate that his denial of bail was for reasons related to the instant case. 2. The firm I was at had a pro bono program and worked with the public defender service in the area. 3. The judge at the bail hearing wasn't the judge for all other hearings in the case. He just happened to be the one handling bail hearings that afternoon. Story 18. Not in court, but a deposition. Plaintiff in a sexual harassment case that was suspected to be paid role play with her boss kept a very detailed diary on her work computer. At one point, she was asked to read from the diary for the record and asked if she had written the accounts and if they were true. She was asked at several points if she wanted her new husband to leave the room while she did this, but declined. Let's just say it was *extremely*kinky. She confirmed it was true, and the only mention of her now husband was that he was boring in bed. But she was going to marry him because she couldn't get her first, second, or third choice. He ended up leaving on his own after she read that part out and confirmed it was him she was writing about. Story 19. I think this qualifies, though it wasn't me that was the lawyer. Got called for jury duty, was at the jury selection phase, and they asked if anyone here thinks they should not. Blah blah. Defendant was in the room. I raised my hand. The defending lawyer looked at me like, oh, this ought to be good, and asked me to explain. I suggested I tell them in private. He insisted I tell the courtroom. I said, okay, I probably shouldn't be on this jury because I was on a previous jury for this man which returned a guilty verdict. Lawyer's face went, oh. Commotion and a wait while they looked up records. Yep, verified. Whole jury was now tainted. Everyone goes home, and they start over. Story 20. Do you see the defendant here in court? Witness victim looks at each jury member, then everyone in the audience. Nope. Judge hides his face behind file folder. Are you sure? Maybe over on this side? Witness looks confused. I'm not sure. I point at defendant. Maybe over at this table by that lawyer. Yeah, maybe. Keep in mind defendant-victim knew each other very well. Edit. Format and spelling. Edit 2. I used the defendant's name, and he was in plain view from the witness stand. I think the witness was just nervous because he was buddies with the defendant. Yes, my questions couldn't have been more leading. OC was fine with me creating apathy in the minds of the jury. Story 21. Not a lawyer, but was working at the jail when an inmate came back from court and immediately went on suicide watch. Apparently he was up for a plea deal and was only looking at 6 months, but started questioning some of the facts, which let in a ton of previously denied evidence. This new evidence linked him to 6 BEs and rapes. He walked out of court facing a 99-year sentence, which he was certain to get, all because he opened his mouth. Edit. The lawyers were arguing over a pair of the victim's panties. He apparently chimed in with something he shouldn't have known. That brought in evidence that was previously inadmissible to not only this case, but 5 other burglary rapes, evidence which by the transport officer's words, good enough to metaphorically him for 100 years. Story 22. Not a lawyer, but I had a big O moment. I was in court for driving while suspended in a county and in front of a judge that were both notorious for putting people who did that in jail. My license wasn't supposed to be suspended. A pencil pusher forgot to press a button or something, and it never got unsuspended after the time was up. I had proof of this, but I was still really nervous. The guy who went up to the judge before me walked to the table where we were supposed to stand, sat down, and put his feet up on the table. The judge asked him what he was doing, and he gave a flippant answer and basically told the judge to get fucked. This seriously pissed the judge off. The judge went off on this guy, and the guy gave everything right back to him off more and more. The judge ended up jailing him for contempt and had the bailiff cuff the guy and put him in a chair off to the side to await the marshals who would transport him to the jail. My name gets called. The judge is looking at me like I'm fresh meat and he is a great white shark. I'm already thinking to myself, okay, if this judge puts you in jail, run over and beat the out of the guy that pissed the judge off so badly. He's why you're going to jail. The judge looks down at his paperwork and back at me and says, "You're Mr. Asterisk, my last name Asterisk?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Yeah, we were talking about you earlier. I'm going to void your arrest and dismiss this case. Your license was supposed to be valid and you shouldn't be here." I let out a huge sigh. The judge asked me if I was okay, and I said I had been a bit worried, especially given the guy that was right before me in line. The judge said, "Don't worry about him. He won't be seeing anything that isn't behind bars for about 90 days. And laughed. Story 23. I'm not a lawyer, but I was a character witness for my childhood dog in a civil trial between our neighbors and my parents. Opposing counsel was questioning me. I wasn't even out of elementary school at the time, and he asked if our dog was aggressive. She was a Rottweiler and very loving and incredibly protective of me and my siblings. His final question to me is one I will never forget. He asked, "Did your father tell you what to say before you came into court today?" I responded, "Yes." Then he asked, "What did he tell you to say?" I said, "The truth." Now I was too young to remember the courtroom reaction, but according to my father, the judge audibly guffawed, and the opposing counsel lost all the wind out of his sails. Story 24. We were just sitting around because of delay of some sort. Over the course of about 5 minutes, about 8 heavily armored sheriff's deputies quietly shuffled into the room, and everyone was told they need to sit real fucking still until told otherwise. Another 3 big boys lead in the defendant, small Italian-American gentleman in shackles. He was up on a few pretty boring fraud charges. I'm guessing he had friends on the outside who wanted to speak to him. Also, there was the guy who called the male judge ma'am. He was funny. Story 25 NAL, but I was on a jury once for a murder trial. Got selected and the trial started almost immediately. Man was on charge with murdering his neighbor. They made their opening statements. There was even a note. It wasn't terribly long, but they clearly put a lot of effort into their strategies and were ready for battle. First witness was called. It was the son of the man on trial. I forget the first question, but it didn't matter. He immediately broke down crying and invoked his Fifth Amendment right. Everyone freaks out. Judge and lawyers were like WTF. Jury had no clue what was going on, but we were quickly ushered out immediately after that. Few minutes later, it was explained to us what happened. The judge declared a mistrial. The prosecutor must have suspected that the father was taking the fall for the son who actually murdered the neighbor. Rather than risk losing, there was a mistrial while they sorted out who to actually charge and try. Edit. Destiny of Doors provided a succinct explanation of the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provides that you cannot be forced to provide testimony that could be used to prosecute you for a crime. Asterisk, asterisk. Story 26. Not a lawyer. Wife is, but she was just watching. Making his statement before the sentencing, the defendant, who molested a stepdaughter, her friend and a niece, pulled a knife from God knows where, and stabbed himself twice before getting wrestled to the ground. How he got it through the metal detector, no one knows. He lived through that, but died 2 months later in prison of natural causes. Story 27. I was involved in a pretty messy custody case. The other party was a mess and had kept the child from my client for a few weeks. OP was playing lots of stupid games and kept requesting continuances. I requested a drug test, which the judge ordered. However, the OP didn't show up for it. To clarify, he did show up. He just stood in front of the toilet for literally 2 hours and claimed he couldn't pee. I was representing the plaintiff, so the burden was on me. I called multiple witnesses that testified to the defendant's drug use. So, opposing counsel decides to call their client for direct examination and asks, "You don't use heroin and crack, right?" That is, for the non-lawyers, a very stupid question for many reasons, especially considering his client didn't show up for his drug test. However, I fully expected the defendant to just lie and say he was clean. After the question was asked, there was a really long pause and the defendant said, "Yes, I do both of those drugs." My head almost exploded. I didn't ask any questions on cross-examination because I didn't want to muddy the waters. I won, and the child is doing great. Story 28. The best O moments are when your opposing counsel or opposing client says or does something that wins the case for you. True, in civil cases, you usually know what will happen ahead of time. But in my state, discovery in smaller civil cases is more limited, and clients don't always want to spend $30K when we can get the same result for $10K. In an adverse possession case, the witness only needed to say, "I use that area as my backyard," and I fully expected him to say this. It would harm my case, but I knew I could get around it. When asked about his use of the area, he said, "No, I never really went back there, didn't use it at all." Lost the case for the other side, and I could barely keep a straight face. It was completely opposite of what the witness had told opposing counsel off the record. Apparently, the under penalty of perjury made him change his story. I had another case about losing multi-unit dwelling insurance because a guy's place was a fire hazard. I asked him if his personal insurer knew about the fire hazard. Yeah, and the jerks canceled my policy. I also love it when I have a difficult party on the other side, and the judge rips them a new one. I had a convoluted case with a lot of parties about nothing at all. The plaintiff was heinous. The 6 or 7 attorneys were working out calendars with the judge when the plaintiff starts yelling at her attorney from across the courtroom because she didn't like that he had conceded some little non-issue. Judge told her to sit down and shut up. I was sad that the case settled because she would have been amazing on the stand. Story 29. I'm not a lawyer, but a court case I was involved with went this way. My ex-mill was a crazy. Me and my wife at the time had cut her off almost completely. Everyone in a hole she would give in and let her mom visit, which always turned out badly. Eventually we got divorced and I got full custody. Emil went nuts and decided to sue me for custody. I looked over the law and for any form of visitation or custody you need to have had contact in the last 6 months, and she hadn't seen them for over a year. So we go to court. I can't afford a lawyer, but the law was pretty clear. She goes through 3 lawyers, each of them quit in turn. So she finally winds up representing herself. During the last hearing, she was talking to the judge and said something to the effect of, "I don't want to get custody of them. I just want to be able to visit." The judge then asked her point blank, "This is a custody hearing. Are you telling me you no longer want to get custody?" She said yes, and the judge dismissed the case immediately. Story 30. Not a lawyer, but shared an oh moment with one. I hit something in the road and had a tire blow out while driving home from Mepes, hit a concrete divider, and wound up rolling my car. No injuries and no other vehicles involved. Received a reckless driving ticket that the officer told me was just procedure and not to be concerned with. Fast forward a month, and I'm in court with my lawyer who plans on pointing out this ticket could prevent my hardship enlistment. He's not expecting it to take more than a minute because the issuing officer and prosecutor are on board. Q Group O moment. I'm 4th on the docket, and the judge has just handed out maximum sentences for all 3 prior defendants. People are getting 6 to 12 months, having licenses revoked, for little stuff. Prosecutor gets screamed at the instant he opens his mouth. Police officer is told to shut up while answering a question the judge asked. My lawyer is told he's about to be held in contempt. I'm starting to think I'm going to get 3 squares and a cot, just not where I planned on getting them. The judge told me to step forward while shuffling my case paperwork, and my lawyer just gave me a look that said, "I'm so sorry. Case dismissed in the interest of justice, and if any more idiots waste his time with nonsense like this again, everyone is spending the night in county." Story 31. Medical malpractice defense lawyer here representing hospitals// doctors. This was not my oh moment, but plaintiff's oh moment. For context, usually at trial, both plaintiff and defendant will have an expert physician testify as to their opinion to whether the doctor, hospital performed everything correctly. I thoroughly researched plaintiff's expert, who was an OB/GYN, baby delivery, and found out he had been suspended a number of times for his own botched deliveries and giving incorrect medical testimony to help plaintiff's cases. During the actual day of trial, turns out he was not licensed to practice medicine independently without supervision from another physician, and he was 1 year into his 3-year suspension. Plaintiff's lawyers had no idea about their own expert's background, and they just sat there with a blank look on their face. Needless to say, during cross-examination, we destroyed his credibility and won at trial. Story 32. New judge with a chip on his shoulder. Plaintiff called me to get an adjournment on a summary judgment motion I had made. They wanted more time to submit opposition. I don't have a problem with this, but the court refuses to accept the adjournment request over the phone and says we have to appear in court the next day. So I go and plaintiff doesn't show up. When our case gets called, I request the adjournment and the judge explodes on me, demands to know why, insists he doesn't grant adjournments, just yells for no reason in front of a courtroom full of attorneys. I tell him it's plaintiff's request and they are not there. They want more time. But he doesn't want to hear it and just says, "Request denied, call plaintiff and tell them to get here by second call." So my oh moment is that I just won my case because the judge decided to be a butthole. I call plaintiff and let them know what happened and they panic. They are about to lose their case. The judge has to grant my motion. It's unopposed. There is no way they can get an attorney to court in time, so the case is called again, and again, I'm the only attorney on the case. I go up to the defendant's table with the biggest eating grin on my face and say, "Your Honor, I'm here on behalf of defendants with an unopposed summary judgment motion." Everyone that saw me get yelled at suddenly realizes what I was doing, getting yelled at for trying to be helpful. And what judge's outburst meant, I win it. The judge has no choice but to soften and rehear my request for an adjournment and grant it. Follow-up. Plaintiff's client died and the motion was never opposed or heard. When they tried to reactivate the case with an administrator, I reminded them that my motion was the first thing to get heard once the case was restarted. They actually read it, knew they had no chance of beating it, and discontinued against my client without ever having to argue the motion. Story 33. Not in court but at a tribunal, and also I was plaintiff, suing for wrongful termination. My rep. So you terminated him because he was ill. Employer. Yes, mister. And he was ill because he's disabled. Employer. Yes, mister. So you fired someone for being disabled. Employer. Yes, edit, formatting, and a word. Story 34. Not me, but my former law partner. She was in court representing a client, I think, in a hearing for a restraining order against her soon-to-be ex-husband. Our client was telling the judge that when they met to exchange the children for visitation, the ex had kicked her. He immediately angrily shouted, "She can't prove it! I didn't leave a mark!" Thanks, buddy. Story 35. I was a baby lawyer in my first year representing the 19-year-old child of some rich people in San Mateo County, CA. My client had gone on a bit of a shoplifting spree, and we were cleaning all her cases up with a global plea, meaning we handled them all at once. Being new, I filled out the plea form wrong, swapping the counts she was charged with for the counts she was pleading to. It's an easy mistake to make. Every court has their own unique form, and I was unfamiliar with San Mateo's. The judge calls my line, starts reading off the plea form, notices the mistake, and then starts screaming at the top of his lungs, "Counsel, what is this? What is this? Is this your first day on the job? This is a court if law and we do not accept mistakes. Fill this plea form OET correctly, or I will have you taken into custody for contempt." I did not expect a reaction like that. My client, who had clearly just taken a huge bong rip at 8 a.m. and who was wearing an all-pink velvet tracksuit, was looking at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world. I corrected the plea form. The judge made me wait until the very end of the calendar to take my plea. Afterward, he called me up to the bench. In private, he told me, "Sorry to ream you like that. Everyone messes the plea form up, so I always pick the youngest lawyer to yell at. The older guys will grumble and complain, but if you noticed, they all fixed their own forms, and we didn't have any more problems." Keeps the calendar running smooth. Where did you go to law school? After that, he invited me into his office for coffee and gave me some really good life-work advice. Turns out he likes talking to new lawyers. TLDR. Judge losses his in court over a simple mistake. Turns out it was all a show for the other lawyers. And I have one of the worst, best court experiences of my early career. Story 36 represented a woman charged with multiple, very serious felonies. She insisted that in the months before the offense, she'd been seriously dating one of the detectives who ultimately wound up investigating and testifying in her case. For a variety of reasons, I trusted this client and believed her, even though the detective never disclosed the relationship in his report. So, during his testimony, I ask, Detective Smith, you had a romantic relationship with Miss Defendant, correct? He goes, what? No, and is visibly offended. The judge yooks at me like I've lost my mind. The Commonwealth attorney audibly says, what? I'm freaking out because a large part of my cross and argument was focused on the bias formed by the prior relationship, and now I've got nothing, and I've lost all credibility. I try again. Detective Smith, have you had a sexual relationship with Missy Defendant? As the Commonwealth rises to object and the judge starts to scold me, the detective goes, oh yeah, it just wasn't very romantic. Edit, update, state is Virginia. The jury acquitted my client of the relatively minor charge that the detective in my story was involved with, but convicted of the other, much more serious charges that detective had nothing to do with. There was a confession and video on the serious charges, so it was kind of a no-brainer. Sorry I'm being kind of intentionally vague. There are no confidentiality concerns, since this all happened in open court. But it's distasteful to give out too much information about a client. The detective was not disqualified. His testimony was not thrown out. Impeachment, no matter how good, doesn't result in you getting to throw out a witness's testimony entirely. By the way, it wasn't really that was the issue. It was that he didn't disclose it to anyone, and his repeated insistence under questioning that he didn't disclose it because it was irrelevant. Like Watergate, it's not the crime. It's the cover-up that gets you. But I don't get to demand the judge throw out the testimony or that charge just because the cop failed to disclose a prior relationship with the defendant. I just get to point it out, argue it in closing, and then hope the jury also sees the relevance. Story 37. Not a lawyer, but a defendant. As a teenager, I got busted with a couple of buddies throwing eggs at cars. We were only actually in the courtroom for our sentencing. There was no trial. The judge called each of us up individually to ask us if we had anything to say. One of my friends tells the judge that he is a good kid who doesn't normally do things like this. Lie, we used to do it all the time. And that I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I wish there was a video of my other friend and I sitting in the benches watching this happen. We simultaneously dropped our heads into our hands because we couldn't believe that idiot just said that. The judge was asterisk, not asterisk pleased, and she took the opportunity to remind him that going to a store, buying eggs, going to another location across town, and then throwing those eggs at cars was asterisk, not asterisk just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Story 38. Not a lawyer, but I got in enough trouble in my teens to know what a judge doesn't like. Uncle's father decided they're going to conserve my grandmother and put her in a secured perimeter memory facility. In reality, they just wanted to away her $20 million estate. We end up in court with our lawyers. One thing I know about most judges and courtrooms, they want to be revered like a church. No talk back, no talking out of turn, wear a suit, even if it's a $20 Goodwill suit. Father, uncles all show up. All of them spend about an hour bad-mouthing me. I'm keeping my mouth shut, looking at my feet. One of my uncles tries to examine me. I just keep my mouth shut until the judge tells him he's not a lawyer, and I'm not examination. None of them are well-dressed, sneakers, dirty sweatpants. My uncle, who's the ringleader, decides to start talking over his own lawyers. My lawyer makes some comment, the judge starts talking to her, and my uncle's lawyer says something like, now hold on, ladies. All they had to do was keep their mouths shut and not tell their lawyers how to do their job, and they would have won. They pretty much handed Grandma and I the win. Story 39, corporate lawyer, but took on a pro bono immigration matter, helping a victim of domestic abuse get her immigration status sorted out. She had been in the country for 20 years, originally legally, but not anymore. It took us multiple months to get a hearing scheduled. We've spent hours in U.S. Customs and Immigration Services offices by this point. Her situation is somewhat precarious and we need to resolve this. She told me a few weeks before the hearing that she needed to reschedule because she was going to be out of the country. She said her daughter was going through a high-risk pregnancy and would be giving birth during that time, and my client was the only caregiver/available family for her daughter. That's fine. We put together a letter, get a note from the daughter's doctor about the medical necessity, etc. USCIS gives us a hard time about it, but ultimately, hearing is rescheduled. My client and her other daughter come to the rescheduled hearing. Client gets asked about recent trips out of the country. Well, I went on vacation to my home country last month. Instant cringe. She's in the US illegally, and it's unclear whether or not she should have been traveling on the passport she was. I jumped in and tried to clean it up for her, and thankfully, this USCIS official was more interested in moving us through the system than getting hung up on past issues. However, she within an inch of this all collapsing around her, getting kicked out of the country. Edit to add, I believe my client's trip was justified and necessary. I think she just misspoke. I spoke to both the pregnant daughter and the doctor who was caring for her while all of this was playing out. Still a scary moment.